Specialist for the Kansas City Public Library, and we are very pleased that you have decided to join us this evening. We will also be live streaming this event, and I'd like to say welcome to those that are viewing online. This evening, we are pleased to have two wonderful individuals presenting. Dr. and Professor Howard French is a career foreign correspondent and global affairs writer and the author of 4 books, including 3 works of nonfiction, a work of documentary photography. He worked as a French-English translator in Abidjan, Ivory Coast, and in the early 1980s. And he taught English literature for several years at the University of Abidjan. His career in journalism began as a freelance reporter for the Washington Post and other publications in West Africa. He joined the New York Times in 1986 and worked as a metropolitan reporter with the newspaper for 3 years. And then from 1990 to 2008, he reported overseas for the Times as the bureau chief for Central America and the Caribbean, West and Central Africa, Japan, and the Koreas, and China, where he was based in Shanghai. During this time, he was twice the recipient of an Overseas Press Club Award, and his work received numerous other awards. Tonight's discussion will be over his recent book, The Second Emancipation. It is the second installment of his trilogy detailing Africa's pivotal role in shaping world history. He discussed his first book in the trilogy, Born in Blackness, with the Kansas City audience in 2021. And in this week where history has been a topic, this is a perfect evening to have this discussion. This evening, the interviewer will be attorney Mickey Dean. Mickey Dean is the retired deputy director of Kansas City's Human Relations Department. While with the department, he has primarily been responsible for the city's enforcement of its civil rights ordinance. He is a founding member of the Kansas City chapter of the National Black United Front, a civic organization with a long history in Kansas City. His focus in NBUF KC has been primarily in the area of international affairs. He has traveled to several African countries as well as to other countries in the diaspora. He has tutored math at the W.E.B. Du Bois Learning Center for over 30 years. He has been a mentor of young Black boys for almost 30 years in 2 programs, the Simba Wachanga, which means Young Lions, and the Males to Men program. He has been intricately involved in Kansas City's Black liberation movement for the last 45 years. He is currently a member of the Kansas City Reparations Coalition. This group is responsible for promoting a local reparations initiative for Kansas City. Attorney Dean attended Emory University, the University of Kansas, and he obtained his law degree from the University of Missouri, Kansas City. He is married to his wonderful wife, Sandra Dean. I present to you Professor French and Attorney Mickey Dean. The floor.
Thank you. Can you all hear me? Good. Thank you all for coming out, and hopefully we'll have a very interesting discussion this evening, and hopefully at the end you have an opportunity to ask a couple of questions. Let me begin, Howard, by telling you that, first of all, I really appreciated the book myself. Back in the Black Power days, we read a lot of Nkrumah, and matter of fact, some of us considered ourselves Nkrumahs, and I remember reading books like Africa Must Unite and Challenge of the Congo, Imperialism, the Highest Stage of neocolonialism, rather, the highest stage of imperialism, the autobiography, conscientism, other works like that. But in spite of all of that, I learned so much from your book. There was just a lot of little nuances about Nkrumah and his development that I didn't know. So I just appreciate the book. I understand that this is the second book in a trilogy that you're doing about Africa's pivotal role in shaping modern world history. So my first question is, what are you trying to accomplish with that trilogy? And in particular, what is the Second Emancipation?
Thank you very much, Nikki. It's a pleasure to be with you on the stage together. We had a few minutes to chat before coming out here, and I was pleased to discover in you somebody who knows much of the terrain of this book and of West Africa in general, as well as having had this history in Black Power, personal history in Black Power, which is so pivotal in terms of the subject matter of this book. What am I trying to accomplish? That's such a difficult question. I write for basically two reasons. One of them is because I love to learn, and the other one is because I don't know how to do anything else with what I learn. I'm an immensely curious person. I hope that comes across in what I write. I have an unusual appetite for reading and for learning. And I can't say that I love writing in terms of the actual physical labor of writing, but I love the project of writing. I love the afterlife of writing. I love being brought together with people as we have come together tonight around writing, and not just my own writing, but with other people's writing. And so that's part of what I'm trying to accomplish. That might sound a little bit generic, perhaps, but the other sort of more specific, more subject-focused goal of the books that you mentioned, I've written books that are not about Africa as well. The purpose of this trilogy is really to excavate the hidden past of the African continent and to reveal it to a public, both in this country and internationally. I was very pleased that my last book, Born in Blackness, was translated into something like a dozen languages. It was, to my grand surprise, a bestseller in Germany, of all places. So to excavate for the public and to reveal to it the richness of the African story. And by the African story, I include the story of the African diaspora, the people of African descent on this stage and in this audience and around this country and in the world. And I think of this as a necessary struggle, if I can speak, if it's not too immodest to speak of the work of a writer as a struggle, because the world has been arranged in such a way as to hide Africa behind a veil of smoke or oblivion, right? That most people, you can reach adulthood in this country and learn almost nothing about Africa. Africa occupies no place except in the narrowest and most stereotypical ways in the news that we are exposed to. So, you know, I don't want to get into the current debate, would be to dignify it too much, but the current political discussions around the history of Africa and the African diaspora in this country. But work like this I find necessary to do because so few people, including, tragically, too few Black people, understand how profoundly essential the role of Africa and of Africans and of the descendants of Africans has been in the creation of the world we inhabit today. And so that's my project, really.
Okay.
Why the Second Emancipation? That was the second volley of your question. I didn't expect this to come right at the top, but I'm pleased that you asked me. The Second Emancipation means simply this. Kwame Nkrumah, the principal figure of my book, led the former Gold Coast, the second most lucrative colony of Britain at the time, into independence in 1957. people may imagine that independence was the changing of flags, that independence was a formal thing, that simply meant that you have your own government or your own currency or your own stamp or your own passport. Independence in the African context, I believe, meant and means, because it's not a finished project, a lot more than that. I call it the Second Emancipation because I believe that there's a continuum between the long era of transatlantic slavery and the period of colonial rule of Africa. Few people learn, I explain in the book, nowhere in the sort of common annals of Western history that we're exposed to in school is it emphasized that the leading democracies, the leading European democracies of the 20th century advocated in the halls of the United Nations for the preservation of forced labor in Africa well into the 20th century. Okay? Well into the 20th century, meaning even in the post-war era. And so an emancipation means more than the formal attainment of independence. It means beginning to get your feet out into the sun as real, full-fledged human beings recognized as such with the same set of rights and privileges and access to dignity that anyone anywhere else in the world has. And as I said, this is a project. It's an ongoing thing. Africa hasn't finished attaining its second emancipation yet, but it begins with the end of the colonial reasons of the colonial period for the reasons that I've just explained. The continuum between slavery and forced labor, which is a kind of neo-slavery.
We're going to get into this in detail a lot more, but right now, succinctly, for people that don't know Kwame Nkrumah, who was Kwame Nkrumah?
He's really challenging me. So he says succinctly, which means I've answered at too great a length already. I wrote a 512-page book on his question. So, so succinctly...
And just introductory for people that don't know
succinctly,
Kwame.
who was Kwame Nkrumah? Kwame Nkrumah was a man born into a family of extremely modest means in the southwestern corner, the extreme southwest remote area of the Gold Coast in the first decade of the 20th century. And Kwame Nkrumah lived, experienced, and benefited from a series of some of the most extraordinary coincidences. I think in a way we can all think of our lives as a string or set of coincidences, but the set of coincidences surrounding Kwame Nkrumah's early life just amount to something totally astounding to me. And much of this was a matter of discovery as I researched the book. His mother was one of several wives of his father, concurrent wives of his father, according to customary sort of marriage practices of the time in that part of West Africa. Very few people, Britain did not create schools for Ghanaians except on the smallest scale you can imagine. So, you know, public school didn't exist. There were only religious schools at the time, Catholic or Protestant schools at the time that Kwame Nkrumah was born. You had to pay to go to them. And the spaces, the number of, the allotment of seats in schools was tiny compared to the size of the population. Kwame Nkrumah's mother, not his first wife, persuaded his father to sacrifice cash, which was scarce, to send Kwame Nkrumah, who was not his first son or his oldest child, to be the one child to go to school. So that's the first big coincidence. That's an act of will. Kwame Nkrumah's mother, not the senior wife, somehow persuaded her husband to do that. Kwame Nkrumah goes to a Catholic school in this remote corner of what becomes Ghana, is identified as a precocious, brilliant, talented individual as, you know, we're talking 7 or 8 years old. This is a one-room schoolhouse. And this Catholic priest who runs the one-room schoolhouse takes him under his wing and gives special attention and and instruction to Kwame Nkrumah. Actually sets Nkrumah in an important way on a path toward what might have led to a Jesuit priest, a life as a Jesuit priest. That's how he begins. Anyway, next big coincidence, Kwame Nkrumah, one of the senior colonial officials of the Gold Coast, a British man, naturally, was touring the region where Kwame Nkrumah was from and happened to stop in at the one-room schoolhouse that Kwame Nkrumah was attending, and the Catholic priest had a word with him and said, "We have a really unusually gifted student here. It would be a pity if we couldn't find something better for him." And this colonial official, like the vice governor of the Gold Coast, basically said, funny thing, we're about to open a special academy for an elite to be forged among our subjects here in the Gold Coast. It will be opened in the next year in the capital, a place that they named Achimota College. And on the basis of your word about this young man, we will reserve a place for him. This is just like a stroke of lightning hitting somebody, right? So Kwame Nkrumah goes off to Achimota College. It's called a college. It's really a boarding school that goes as far as high school. And he falls under the example and sway of another remarkable person, totally a matter of coincidence, the only African schoolmaster in this school, a man named James Agre, who had been to study in the United States and had done graduate work at Columbia University, where I teach. Agre was a Pan-Africanist. Agre was an academically gifted person, a man so talented, he had mastered. Agre had mastered Greek and Latin to the point where he was teaching it in the Gold Coast at this time. And Agre lights a fire in the mind of Nkrumah that instead of going off to Britain to study, as the very, very small number of people from the Gold Coast were able to do back in that era, that he should go off to the United States to study. This turns out to be a tremendously important development in the life of Kwame Nkrumah. It doesn't happen right away, but it plants this seed as it plants the seed of Agre's emphasis on Pan-Africanism. Okay. Nkrumah arrives in Accra, the capital of the Gold Coast and now of Ghana, at a time when a crusading Nigerian figure had been hired by a black Gold Coast newspaper publisher, hired this incredibly talented young Nigerian man to edit his newspaper. And this Nigerian newspaper editor, I'm jumping ahead to tell you this, years later becomes the president of Nigeria, Nnamdi Azikiwe, another incredible coincidence. Azikiwe is this extraordinarily progressive, crusading guy who takes it upon himself in the pages of a printed newspaper at a time when you could get arrested and put away for this, to crusade against British colonial rule in Ghana and in Africa, and to propound principles of what we would recognize today as Pan-Africanism. Azikiwe had also studied in the United States and then goes on to write a letter of recommendation for Kwame Nkrumah, who comes from a penniless background and who thinks he's going to become a Jesuit, to go study at Lincoln University in Pennsylvania, one of the oldest historically black colleges and universities in the United States, and the oldest one to do graduate work. And so, sorry?
Yeah, I'm gonna get into that a little more.
Okay. Did I do justice to who, like I didn't talk about
we've
the political...
got some more to talk about, Nkrumah, assure you. But let me ask you this, because you mentioned...
It's a whole book.
You mentioned Ezekiel and Pan-Africanism because, as I told you before we came on, is back in the Black Power movement, a lot of us fancied ourselves to be Pan-Africanists. So, and that's a term that you use in the book title. Can you talk about what was Nkrumah's idea of Pan-Africanism?
So if I can try to ventriloquize Kwame Nkrumah. That's quite an act because he's actually dead now. So I'm not just projecting his voice, but I have to try to inhabit his spirit, right? So I think Kwame Nkrumah's belief about Pan-Africanism went something like this. That, as he actually stated, no Africans will be free until all Africans are free. But then something additional on top of that, which is really, for me, the essence of Pan-Africanism. Pan-Africanism means something, it's a statement or it's an expression of a desire for Africa and Africans to attain their rightful place in the world. Not simply, as I mentioned before, to have flags of their own or presidents of their own, but to attain a structured existence that can guarantee them the ability to defend themselves in a tough world, and to defend themselves, to fend for themselves successfully in a tough world. Pan-Africanists like Kwame Nkrumah believed that the tiny, for the most part, countries that had been created in the Berlin Conference when Europe divided up Africa among themselves in 1884 and 1885 were not appropriate vehicles for true independence. That Africa, the Africa you see on the map today, has something like 54 countries, almost 20 of which are landlocked. Many of them are small in size and population. And so part of this Pan-Africanist dream was not just to come together as Africans, but to build something of scale, not for a romantic reason, but for a practical reason, because only by building a political project at scale did people like Kwame Nkrumah believe that Africa would be able to fend for itself in the world. And fending for itself in the world, by the way, had one final element to it, and it's an important theme of my book. You asked me about the title, The Second Emancipation. I'm going to refer to a piece of the subtitle, which is Global Blackness at High Tide. Kwame Nkrumah's Pan-Africanism meant very explicitly, that Africans born of and in the African continent had to forge effective bonds with people of African descent outside of Africa, and that they needed to constitute each other's first and primary, most important resource in the world. For this purpose, being able to fend for ourselves in a hostile world, that we needed these kinds of synergies and this kind of scale in order to do so.
You mentioned that Nkrumah studied in the United States. I believe he spent 10 years here at Lincoln and also at the University of Pennsylvania. What do you think that time that he spent here in the United States, how did that help his development along the way? What did he gain from his experience here?
Well, he gained, first of all, 4 degrees in American higher education in rapid succession, and would have had a 5th had the University of Pennsylvania not told him that they thought that his approach to philosophy was too ideologically driven. So that's the first thing he gained, and I don't think that's a negligible thing. Kwame Nkrumah was, first of all, a very thirsty learner. He left the United States after 10 years here in 1945, expecting to go to law school in Britain. And he got caught up in the student movement in Britain, and that put him on a path toward politics and independence, which we'll talk about, I assume, later. So that's just to give you a sense of his intellectual ambition. But what else did he gain? He begins tons of things. So he starts out wanting to be a priest in the Catholic tradition. He comes penniless to America. He has to pay his tuition at Lincoln. One of the many things he begins to do, he does other people's homework for money. One of the other things he does is preach in churches in the Philadelphia and Baltimore area, the sort of mid-Atlantic, and he is so versatile that even though he has a Roman Catholic background, he becomes very adept at preaching at Baptist and Methodist churches, Black Baptist and Methodist churches in the mid-Atlantic. Okay, that's quite a leap, right? This turns out, I think, to be a really important piece of his development as a charismatic politician. How to hold your audience in your hand, and how to read the crowd, and how to meet them where they are, rhetorically speaking, not to stoop, but to meet them in a way that can lead them and inspire them. He gets all of that in this church, in the ambit of these church experiences. The final thing, so as not to give you too long an answer here, the final thing he does, I think, that's really, really important, is he begins to make these forays to Washington, D.C. and to Howard University. He doesn't attend Howard University, but he begins to frequent Howard University at a time when Howard University had the most extraordinary assemblage of Black intellectual talent you can imagine in its era. Just an incredible roster of people who were drawn from African America, but also from the Caribbean and from Europe. And Kwame Nkrumah plunges into this world, and it creates all sorts of connections that become resources to him intellectually and politically down the road over the next 10 or 15 years that all steer him toward a political destiny as opposed to a sterile, I don't want to say that, let me scratch that word, sterile. I work at a university. I don't want to talk badly about working at universities. A cloistered university existence, right? These connections put him on a path toward activism. He gets to know personally W.E.B. Du Bois. He gets to know personally C.L.R. James. He gets to know personally George Padmore. He gets to know personally a whole roster of just truly extraordinary people by virtue of this making himself a sort of figure around town in Washington in sort of Howard University circles. And so those are the three things that I would focus on.
I want to venture away from Nkrumah just a little bit, but this is something that you mentioned in your book, and it's something that we hear a lot. Africans sold their own people into slavery, and basically saying that the Africans are as responsible for the transatlantic slave trade as Europeans are. And you addressed that in your book. How do you analyze that statement?
Did I address that in this book?
Yeah, you did.
Okay. I spent a lot of time on that in my last book, okay. So that's why I asked the question. So I'm delighted to answer your question. I didn't really expect it, but I'm delighted to answer it. So, this is really complicated, and that's not an evasion. The viewpoint that says, and I hear this often, that Africans are just as responsible for their plight as people bound up in enslavement, as the people who bought them and transported them across the Atlantic. That viewpoint is a radical and, I think, cynical distortion of the reality of what was taking place. First of all, what was the slave trade as experienced on the coast of West Africa? I'm not saying that it was a good thing to be trading in slaves if you were an African, but the Africans who were trading in slaves had never been to the Americas. See that there was such a thing called a world of plantations in the United States or in the Caribbean, where people, in the case of the sugar industry, for example, be it Louisiana or Haiti or Jamaica, where the life expectancy of an enslaved person was an ordinary feature of doing business. It was a planned matter of private enterprise then, that your slaves would have to be replaced every 5 years because they would simply die. That's how badly they were being overworked, okay? No African who sold a slave had ever seen or imagined that there could be an institution called chattel slavery, okay? Does this mean that these were wonderful people selling other people into slavery? That's not my point. My point is they were not consciously part of any kind of project called chattel slavery. None of them had had the benefit of being taken on a tour of the Caribbean or of the American South to see what this was all about. They didn't know what the purpose was. They knew that white people began showing up in the early 1500s and were willing to sell goods to local chiefs, desirable goods, often luxury goods, to local chiefs in exchange for human beings. And the human beings that tended to be sold for the majority of the length of the transatlantic slave trade tended to be people who had been the losers in local conflicts. In other words, people A fight people B, people A win and capture a certain number of prisoners from people B. Prisoners from people B are hard to manage locally. The women in the grand sweep of African history, slavery was an institution all over Africa before the white people showed up, just as slavery was an institution all over Europe and all over the world throughout history, right? But the tradition in Africa over the sweep of this history of slavery was that the vanquished populations, women would be assimilated into, that sounds like a pretty word, right? I'm not suggesting this was pretty, right? But if your group was defeated by my group absorbed the women from your group through intermarriage or forced circumstances that probably were quite unpleasant. But over time, you were assimilated, you became part of the group of winners. You were adopted into that society. The offspring became natives of the victorious group, right? So when white people showed up with desirable goods to trade, the coastal societies, for the most part, that participated in the European slave trade, the transatlantic slave trade, saw a solution to a difficult problem that they had, what to do with the men. So you've absorbed the women into your victorious camp. What do you do with the men? To take men prisoner, you have to surveil them. That takes a lot of resources and energy. Should we kill them? Should we force them into some form of local bondage? So the Europeans show up and say, we will give you cloth, we will give you worked metal, we will give you guns, we will give you alcohol, we will give you tobacco, et cetera, in exchange for, to a great degree, young men. And this becomes it's hard for us to imagine how appealing a transaction this might have seemed from the perspective of the local population. I just want to say one more thing. Africans, when the Europeans showed up, did not know they were Africans. You're going to think, what do I mean by that? Am I saying they were stupid? No, I'm not saying they were stupid. I'm saying everybody was African. There was nothing special about, hey, you're going to sell our brothers into slavery. That's not how Africans thought. Africans achieved a picture of themselves as African only over time and in contact with exploitation from the outside. And this has been the case on every continent in the face of European imperialism. American Indians. American Indians didn't start out saying, hey, we're all American Indians. Why didn't American Indians all unite and say, let's defeat the white man, look what they're doing? Because they didn't think of themselves as all being American Indians. They thought of themselves as we are this, and they are that, and these guys are the other. And sometimes we fight among ourselves, and sometimes we have alliances with each other. This is just the people from here. We're not a constituted race that has some kind of identity basis of unity. That's kind of projecting backwards in a naive or romantic way, trying to understand why did Africans do this to each other.
Let me ask you this. In the 50s, and this is something that I wasn't aware of, that there was a lot of interest among a lot of blacks in this country in what was going on in the continent. And you mentioned in your book people like Richard Wright and Ralph Bunche, A. Philip Randolph, had a great interest in what was going on in Africa. And I even, last year I discovered Dr. King's sermon at Dexter Avenue Baptist Church that he preached after he attended the independence celebration of Ghana. And so I've just been kind of amazed that the amount of attention is, and also the black press, Pittsburgh Courier, they all covered Africa quite a bit. And I guess my question is that what was their attraction in this country, given all the problems that we had as far as racism, what was their attraction to what was going on in Africa at that time?
So this gets a lot of attention in my book, the background to this question. The way that Africa in the 1950s fires the imagination of African Americans. And I guess the most proximate, the most essential or vital cause for this is captured in the story of Kwame Nkrumah, seeing this man win independence from the greatest imperial power in the world, defeating them in a nonviolent way, actually from a jail cell. Nkrumah wins his first election under British colonial rule from jail, right? And at a time when the United States was still in a relatively early stage of its civil rights movement, this was a remarkable spectacle. To see the tactical brilliance that Nkrumah was able to employ to achieve his ends was deeply inspiring. That's element one. Element two is, you know, I use a phrase in my book saying something, it's maybe a little bit too, right? But there's a phrase in my book that says something like this, that Nkrumah was like Obama before Obama. Do you all remember? There are a lot of reasons to feel ambivalent about Obama today, right? But do you all remember the first time you saw, or the first few times you saw Obama come off Air Force One? People remembered that. Like, wow, this is a new thing now. Now we can really see it. This is really new, right? So Nkrumah had that effect on African Americans. Nkrumah was the first head of state of any country in the world to visit John F. Kennedy as president. Nkrumah came down his airplane stairway in 1963. You know, if you think Obama was a spectacle, just try to imagine the spectacle of that era, seeing a man like this from a place in Africa descending the stairway, his airplane, going where? Going to the White House to see the new American president as the first guest of that new American president. And so from the tactical brilliance of his winning independence from the British, all the way to the power of his example, to the kind of dignity and bearing. You mentioned the black press. Black press covered, first of all, the black press was huge in this era, in the 1950s and 60s, and has withered quite a bit since then, as in fact, the general press has withered a lot too, but the black press has really shrunken vastly since compared to the 40s, 50s, and 60s, right? The black press covered Nkrumah like he was the most important person in the world. And part of a theme that runs through the coverage in paper after paper, the Chicago Defender, the Pittsburgh Courier, is just the sheer dignity of bearing of this guy. Just seeing this guy, the dignity with which he carries himself and you know, moves about. And you see in the editorials and the news columns of these newspapers, writers saying things, it's a bit naive actually in retrospect, but writing things that you can just tell the genuineness of sentiment, how touched they were. If white people can see a black man from Africa behave this way and comport himself this way and hold his own with the leaders of the white world this way, then maybe they will be able to see that we African Americans are their equals too, and that we deserve to be treated just with just as much dignity as well, right? That's the effect.
Okay. I'm going to skip around a little bit due to time, but Ghana gained its independence in 1957, and one of the things that Nkrumah said, he said basically it means little for Ghana to have its independence if the rest of Africa does not have independence. In other words, we need this continental unity. What was so important to him about African continental unity, where he really felt that Ghana really wouldn't have a chance to develop as a nation if all of the other countries were still in colonialism?
I think he felt that way. I spoke earlier to his belief in his notion of Pan-Africanism being bound up in a sense of the importance of scale, that Africans, as divided and subdivided by the Berlin Conference into what are now 53 countries, that African countries, almost no African countries had any kind of serious scale to them in terms of territory or population. And because of the lack of scale, they were unlikely to achieve great economic strength. And so Nkrumah believed that Africans needed to figure out a way to come together to have political, to have nation states that had large populations and could develop large markets and would be attractive places for investors to want to build industries in, to industrialize. And so that's one piece. And Nkrumah died, the last phase of his political life was a struggle to plant the seeds of industrialization in Ghana through the building of what was then the world's largest artificial lake, which was created to power a hydroelectric dam, which was needed in order to build an aluminum industry. Ghana has world-class bauxite reserves. And so Nkrumah's dream was to industrialize by building an aluminum industry using hydroelectric power from this dam. And he was strung along all the time by the Kennedy administration. He had very frequent communications with John Kennedy. And Kennedy knew how to charm Nkrumah. But in some ways, to use a phrase of Donald Trump, Nkrumah came to understand that Kennedy was tapping him along. That's what Trump says about Putin. So Kennedy was tapping him along, leading him to believe that America was really going to come to bat for Ghana in its industrialization policy, when in fact the United States was holding most of its finances and enthusiasm in reserve. Nkrumah saw Africa caught in the vice of a Cold War, where the Soviet Union on the one hand and the United States on the other hand were battling each other to parcel up the world for their own purposes, and not for the benefit necessarily of the peoples who would, in one way or another, ally themselves with these big superpowers. And so Nkrumah's belief, in Nkrumah's iteration of Pan-Africanism, was that we have to avoid being put on a conveyor belt toward an American future or toward a Soviet future. We have to build an African future. And an African future, the best version of a future for Africa can only be built if we can scale up through Pan-Africanism, through breaking down borders between ourselves and building bigger, initially regional nation states, and then eventually a continental nation state.
We're getting a signal that it's almost time for some audience questions. I got a couple of more that I have to ask you. One is that, can you talk about what were some of the main challenges that Nkrumah faced in trying to develop Ghana into a strong nation, and what eventually caused its downfall?
So the challenges to building a strong nation state were many, 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 multiple. So first of all, Britain and France and Belgium and whatnot, Portugal, they didn't colonize Africa to build modern nations. They colonized Africa to exploit these territories. And as I mentioned at the outset, most of these places, that involved, to a very late date, forced labor. The British and the Belgians and the French and the Portuguese were creating mining or agriculture for commodities that were meant to make colonialism, first of all, pay for itself. In other words, the Africans had to pay to be colonized. Their labor was being expropriated, which is a kind of tax, to pay for their own colonization, but secondly, and more importantly, actually, to fill the treasuries of the colonial powers, right? And so Ghana achieves independence in 1957. There's no civil service in Ghana. There was not a single senior civil servant that the British had brought along up until that point. So that's the first obstacle. How do you run a country? Nkrumah had 4 degrees accumulated in a rapid period, and there was a tiny elite of other people who had been, to good schools here and there. But you need a lot more than that to effectively run a country with ambition and drive. And so that was one really big challenge. Another really big challenge was that the British, in their colonial approach to Ghana and to many other places, was one of indirect rule. And indirect rule means appoint local chiefs in various places and let them administer day-to-day life locally, collect taxes and keep order and things like that, and report up to a distant kind of a British colonial official. This is a shoestring way of running a colony instead of building a civil service, right? But what indirect rule tended to do in Ghana and in many other places, Nigeria, Sudan, many other places, was to encrust ethnic fiefdoms. And so ethnic group A would have their chiefs recognized by the British as having some special entitlement, and then now independence comes and you have a new unitary government for a country, but the ethnic chiefs of one region or another don't want to fade into the background or cede any of their prestige or authority. They want to carry on. They have been elevated by the British, and they think that they're entitled to some kind of power or some kind of say over the governance of their country, and they can very easily appeal to popular opinion among their tribe or ethnic group to foment trouble. And that happened a lot in Ghana, that happened a lot in many other places. So I'm just going to mention one final thing. So that's domestically. The final thing that really frustrates Nkrumah in his efforts to spread the idea of Pan-Africanism is that the power of Nkrumah's example was too successful for its own good. Nkrumah leads Ghana into independence in 1957. There's a rush of other African countries. This would have happened eventually anyway, but the Nkrumah example really galvanized the African continent. There's a rush of other countries to demand independence. The European powers sort of throw up their hands and say, well, I guess we have to sort of cede this role to local politicians. And when local politicians in one place after another inherit the trappings of office as new presidents, new prime ministers and heads of government and the like, with all of the prestige and the benefits that come with those things, most of them did not want to hear about, let's now, having just attained local independence, let's now surrender some of our prerogatives to some larger entity called a regional federation, or even less, to a Pan-African government for the whole continent. There was great personal benefit in being the president of a new country, right? You and your allies and friends stand to gain a lot from that personally. And so this was the final obstacle. Just one, if I may, one other thing. So in the early 90s, I said that Gold Coast was the second most lucrative colony of Britain in the post-war era, after Malaysia. Gold Coast earned more foreign currency for Britain than any other place in the world in the post-war era, except for Malaysia. And Gold Coast did that mostly through gold, which its name comes from, but especially from cocoa. Gold Coast was then by far the world's leading cocoa producer, okay? And so cocoa, Nkrumah actually inherits reasonably good finances. He doesn't have a civil service. He doesn't have a large education base in the population. He doesn't have good roads. He doesn't have schools. He has to build most things from scratch, but he had a fair amount of money in the treasury because of gold and cocoa. when he gains independence. And so in 1957, he begins to elaborate very ambitious economic plans, including the hydroelectric dam, which very belatedly gets built at the end of his rule, including a new town outside of Accra called Tema, including a road system, including a national school system, et cetera, et cetera. And then in 1960 or thereabouts, the international cocoa market collapses. The price for cocoa plummets. And this is like a dagger in the heart of the Ghanaian economy that Nkrumah never recovered from. And so those are the things that I would tick off in a pretty complicated tableau as the leading elements of frustration and the roadblocks for Nkrumah to realize his ambitions.
Well, thank you. Please thank Harrison. And before Ms. Sanders Brooks says anything, I'm going to tell you this. There's a lot that we didn't get to. So what that means is you got to buy the book, okay? It's a fascinating book, and I encourage everyone to buy it. Ms. Sanders Brooks.
Thank you, Mr. Dean. We would like, if you have questions, please come up to the mics. If you have questions, please come up to the mic.
What was Nkrumah's relationships with Francophone Africa, with somebody like Senghor and the Negritude movement within Francophone Africa?
Okay, in 1947, Nkrumah, before he returned to Ghana to launch himself formally into politics, he traveled to Paris from London to meet with Leopold Senghor, who was in the French Parliament at the time, representing the French colony of Senegal, and to meet with Félix Houphouët-Boigny, who was also in the French Parliament as a deputy in the French Parliament representing the Ivory Coast. These were the two most prosperous French colonies in West Africa, and Nkrumah tried to interest them in this idea of a West African federation, of coming together even across colonial language barriers to form a supranational entity that would be a federative nation state in West Africa. He was snubbed by Houphouët-Boigny and kind of patronized by Senghor. Senghor, very interesting character. We could spend a long time talking about actually either of these people, and we don't have a long time, but Senghor, at that time, we're talking 1947, was in the midst of a debate underway in French society about how to incorporate an eventually independent Africa into the French nation state. In other words, there were people in France, including Senghor, advocating that French-speaking African colonies should join France, should become part of France as independent entities in a grand French assemblage of states, right?
Like Algeria?
No, not exactly. Algeria was a settler colony, and so that's a very different history. Senghor was a leading proponent of this idea. Some people in the French left were propounding this idea. This idea was scuttled eventually when Senghor, it became clear to the French political world that what Senghor was saying is, we don't simply want to have independence under the French flag and claim that we are happy to be considered French. We're saying that if we are going to be considered French, we should have all the rights and benefits of French people, that we should have French Social Security and French health insurance and French, the right to reside wherever we want in France, meaning we can come live in France just as your people can come live in Africa. When the progressive French who were trying to elaborate this notion of an enlarged French state that would include African countries began to hear how forcefully, how articulately Senghor argued for these things, they said, well, no, certainly not. We cannot have France underwrite Africans. Mind you, Africans have been underwriting France for the last 500 years.
Thank you. This is a question from a colleague of mine that heard that you were going to be here in Kansas City. And he wanted to ask you a question on a quote by Clarence J. Munford from his book, Race and Reparations, where Munford says, African American emancipations were not emancipations at all.
I'm not familiar with this quote, and I don't really hear an explicit question in the formulation. It's a very interesting quote in the sense that it sort of rhymes with what I said about African independence being a second part of a second emancipation, just a part of a second emancipation. In other words, if I can interpret the question, this Mumford person is saying that freedom for African Americans has not fully been attained yet. Is that the point?
Pretty much.
Yes, so I think that it concords with what I was saying about an ongoing effort at emancipation. The first big step, independence and the end of forced labor, constituted, was the inspiration for the title of my book. Yeah.
Thank you.
Professor French, thank you for coming to speak with us here in Kansas City. Would you tell us how Nkrumah was able to navigate and build coalitions locally while bridging the gap between the colonial powers? How was he able to set that up? What was it about him that made that happen?
When you say bridging the gap with the colonial powers,
Yes.
what do you mean by that?
That Ghana is becoming a new nation. Mm-hmm. So he's got to deal with England. But you have the chiefs, the smaller organizations. How was he able to convince and build that coalition to make that work as a nation state?
So this was a titanic struggle that took a long time to work itself out. Nkrumah wins election for the first time in 1951 from a jail cell, which I told you all earlier. And if I may be forgiven for selling my book a little bit, this is one of the really exciting pieces of the narrative. There are a bunch of other ones, but I'm particularly fond of that story. Okay, so Nkrumah wins the election. The British had thought that a class of conservative lawyers and business people who had all been to school in Britain, who had formed a political party, they were surely going to win the election. And so the British didn't really have Nkrumah on their radar as a viable candidate. And Nkrumah wins the election by a landslide, okay? This drives both Britain and the conservative lawyer class crazy in their own separate ways. The British figure, well, we can't really say that he can't have any role in the country because we're the ones who set up the election, and now he's won it by a landslide. But so the British then set off on a whole series of dilatory processes, how to stretch out the period during which power will be transferred to Nkrumah almost by the spoonful, right? And what the British do between 1951 and 1957 is make Nkrumah win election 3 times. Nkrumah had to win 3 elections, all of which he won by large margins, before he was actually granted independence. So in the background, as all of this was happening, I think in the beginning, Britain was hoping that the local forces that you're referring to would undo Nkrumah, that they would get their act together and that they would unite against Nkrumah, and that, you know, the British thought of Nkrumah as a kind of rabble-rouser and head of a kind of lumpen proletariat types, and that these well-trained, moneyed characters in this other conservative political party would get their act together and finally win. That obviously didn't happen, but in the meantime, the local chiefs from certain key ethnic constituencies entered into struggle against Nkrumah. And it really looked for a time between 51 and 57 like the Gold Coast was going to fall apart as a colony, that it wouldn't hold together, that the Ashanti who were and are the largest single ethnic group in Ghana, a people with a grand imperial history of their own. The Ashanti Empire is a real thing. That the Ashanti would say, look, we're not going to be governed by this guy Nkrumah. We're just going to break off and create our own. If we can't have a federal system here in Ghana, we'll just break off and create an Ashanti polity, right? This happens time and again between 51 and 57. And Nkrumah just outlasts all of this. First of all, the British, halfway between 51 and 57, they kind of see the writing on the wall. They see that the conservatives are not going to get their act together, that there's no avoiding Nkrumah, and they finally start telling Nkrumah's opponents, no, don't look to us to help you. We're not going to help you beat this guy. If you can beat him in the third election, so be it. But don't look to us to help you beat him. And so this is how Nkrumah survives all of these things.
Let's do these 6 people that are already lined up, and then we have a couple from people watching at home.
And Professor,
Because I can't,
you can make your answers.
because I,
Okay?
yes.
Let's go,
Okay.
sir.
Thank you. No, I appreciate the book and sharing your research with us. I had quick questions. I kind of think they're, kind of a 3-part question. They're all kind of related. Maybe to his last book, Neocolonialism, The Last Stage of Imperialism, which you're kind of articulating what neocolonialism is, local chiefs, kind of the lack of independence of land and the economy, And I guess my question is, currently right next door, Burkina, the AES countries, they seem like they've read his book, and are, navigating around certainly French neocolonialism and imperialism. And also, there's a whole bunch of photos of Kwame Nkrumah and Mao, 1950, in China and Africa, these development paths. China is now, producing things that can't be produced here. And Ghana would be on that same path, with electricity, from this dam. Could you speak to maybe the AES and his last book?
So the AES, for those in the audience who don't know, is a coalition of states in West Africa that are inland states in what is called the Sahel, which is a band that runs just south of the Sahara Desert. So the principal constituents are Burkina Faso, Niger, and Mali. And these are states that have experienced a lot of violence in the last decade or so. I'm going to try to phrase this in as neutral a way as I can. It's a very complicated situation, and the details are different from one of these countries to the next. But there have been insurgencies of various kinds, in some cases ethnically based. For example, in Mali, with the Tuareg ethnic group from the north of the country being the principal kind of agent, and then in other instances, what is fashioned in the American media landscape as radical Islam. So you have had insurgent groups fighting central government in all 3 of these countries, and France, being the former colonial power, had been engaged with these countries for a decade or so in a very poorly executed and conceived counterinsurgency war. And finally, these countries, one after the other, basically told France, this is not working, you're killing innocent people in the pursuit of this war, and your presence here has become onerous and unpopular, so we'd like you to leave. And so one after another, these former French colonies have expelled or radically downgraded their relations with France, and have looked elsewhere for support, in some cases to Russia and also to each other. So that's what AES suggests, that they're looking to cooperate together to kind of reinforce security in the region and for the benefit of their peoples. The AES, to speak very generally, are inspired by the example of Nkrumah and of conscientism and neocolonialism, those books. But I think also probably more recently by the example of Thomas Sankara, who was the head leader of Burkina Faso at the birth of that nation in 1986. I knew Thomas Sankara personally. I wrote about him in this book. You know, I haven't really decided how I feel about all of this. I'm not really sure that the AES have a coherent program. I really respect and admire and support the notion of, this gets back to Nkrumah's sort of guiding thought, that we have to stand on our own feet, we have to come together among ourselves, we can't be the playthings of the East or the West. You know, all of those sentiments I totally support. I'm just not sure I've seen enough programmatic coherence from the AES states to make me believe that what is going to be a very difficult challenge for them is going to be able to work out. I just don't know yet.
Well, I'll try to make it really simple. Thank you so much, Professor French, and great interview. I'm from Ghana, and I'm also an Ashanti, so.
Etesai.
Yep. Yeah. My question is, how did global powers view influence? How did that influence him for the push of African emancipation? And when I mean global powers, I mean the US, the USSR, the Britain. How did those view influence Nkrumah's push for African emancipation?
Nkrumah was, I'm tempted to use foul language in an admiring way. Nkrumah was a bad, you know how the rest of the phrase goes, okay? He really was, okay? I'm not saying Nkrumah was perfect. I don't know any perfect people, right? And a lot of things didn't turn out the way one would have hoped, right? But Nkrumah most definitely was a bad fill in the blank, okay? He told Kennedy to his face, I'm going to do things my way. You guys have your way, we have our way, okay? He pushed for the United States to support his economic program. I think Kennedy, by and large, I'm not naive about John Kennedy in a big picture sense, but I think by and large, John Kennedy, vis-a-vis Africa, up until the the death of Lumumba, was a pretty progressive character. Kennedy was surrounded, however, by a lot of people who said, either you're with us or against us, meaning with the United States or against the United States. Why are you dealing with this Nkrumah guy? He doesn't declare that he's with us. Like, that must mean that he's with them, whoever the them is, whether it's the Soviet Union or Beijing or whatnot, right? And Kennedy told Nkrumah this. Kennedy was tapping Nkrumah along, to use the language of today, right? Like, flirting with providing money to build this big dam, which only gets built at the end of Nkrumah's rule. He stretched out forever. Flirting with providing the money and telling Nkrumah at one point, Kwame, like every time I get ready to give you to approve, it's not giving money, by the way, it's guaranteeing a loan. Every time I get ready to guarantee the loan, you say something critical of the West or of the United States or something like that. And Kwame Nkrumah told Kennedy straight up, that's just the way it is. I'm not doing this to provoke you. I'm doing this because I'm being me. I'm an African. I'm not an American. I'm not a Russian guy. I'm an African. I'm promoting what I think is good for Africa and what Africa needs. I have the utmost respect for that, right? Nkrumah went on the very eve of one of these negotiations with the White House. He went on something, forgive me if I don't remember the exact duration, it's astounding. He went on a tour of the East Bloc that lasted something like 5 weeks. You know, he went to the Soviet Union, traveled across the Soviet Union, went to all of these other Soviet bloc countries, and then went to China. By the way, China, which at the time was at loggerheads with the Soviet Union. China and the Soviet Union did not get along. So Nkrumah is basically saying, I don't kowtow to any of you people. I'm talking with Kennedy right now about this money. I'm going off to the Soviet Union, and by the way, before I go back to Ghana, I'm going to stop in Beijing, right? He's like, I want to be able to talk to everybody on equal terms. And this gets at the why do we need scale? We need scale. Nkrumah, in the end, was not allowed to do that. He did not succeed because the world was not ready for a black man to behave that way, right? But he did not let himself be intimidated or cowed. He persevered, right? And I have the utmost respect for that.
Come on this side now.
I'll keep it short and sweet.
It's me, I'm the problem.
Comment vas-tu ce soir, mon frère?
Je vais très bien.
Merci,
Et vous?
merci.
Mais ce n'est pas une question.
We can, but I won't. So, Ms. French, thank you very much. I appreciate your work. I thank you for your work of decades of work of covering the continent and the historical work that you're doing. Two very quick comments. One on just what you just said. I mean, Du Bois is there and telling Nkrumah where to go, right, with the Soviet bloc, and he's already done it. So that's and that type of thing. I also appreciate you bringing up Lincoln and the importance of Lincoln and Horseman Bond and those individuals that are coming at that time. And more, I haven't read the book, but I hope there's more in there. And
Oh, there's a lot about Horace Mann
yeah,
Bond.
he's key. Which brings me to my question. What do we do with someone that's not talked about as much as needs to be, a person like St. Clair Drake, that's going there, influenced, but then also has a falling out in many ways, becomes disillusioned with Nkrumah? I'm sure it's in the book, but that's the question that I have is, here's this tour de force in the U.S. in what he's doing and thinking about Pan-Africanism and global blackness, to use your terms. So a little bit on the relationship with St. Clair Drake and Nkrumah would be wonderful. Thank you.
This will be lost on most of the people listening here. St. Clair Drake was a formidable black, globally minded intellectual in mid-century America, and was a Pan-Africanist. And honestly, I don't know. I can't tell you very much about the nature of the personal relationship with Nkrumah. What I can say is that most of the people who fell away from Nkrumah among this kind of global black-minded world did so after 1960. So Nkrumah, I did a podcast interview, was it yesterday, the day before yesterday, in which somebody said to me, Nkrumah, why did he fail? He didn't really last very long. He was only head of Ghana from 57 to 66. And I had to correct the guy. I said, actually, he didn't fail even by that way of looking at it. He won the election from jail in 51. You can't hold against him the fact that the British didn't give him the keys to the castle until 1957. He was the leading figure. He was the driving force in the history of this place called Ghana from 1951 to 1966. So it's from 1960 or thereabouts, 61 maybe, where a lot of these characters become highly disenchanted with Nkrumah. And they become disenchanted for reasons that I think are, I'm tempted, I've often wondered how I would have behaved or what I would have thought in the moment, right? I know a lot more than you could have known in the moment, right? But Nkrumah responded to the collapse of cocoa prices and to being tapped along by the United States in terms of the financial backing for his grand industrial project. In other words, the United States keeping, like Lucy and the football and Charlie Brown, like never quite giving him the football, right? He responded to these two grand calamities, really, by rendering the state ever more intrusive in the economy and in the lives of Ghanaian people to a point of excess, right? And part of this, I think a lot of this was driven by a lot of bad things in the world happen out of good intentions. And I think a lot of this was driven by good intentions. And Nkrumah's looking around himself, and he's seeing that he still doesn't have the human resources he needs to make things work out in an ideal way. That there's that a lot of the people who he thought he could trust actually turned out to be thieves. Nkrumah was, there's even, I know a lot of people who hate Nkrumah in Ghana today. I have never heard from any of them, and quite serious people, a coherent case that Nkrumah was a thief. So Nkrumah is dealing with people who are not just not necessarily very good managers or people that he can delegate to, but who are beginning to steal. And Nkrumah is surrounded by people who are pushing him to inject his own personality, in other words, a cult of personality, into the equation as a substitute for all of the gaps and interstices that he can't fill with other personalities or talents or abilities from people that are just not available to him. And the possibilities of his rule become exhausted, right? And people begin trying to kill him. Nkrumah is the target of multiple assassination attempts. And you just, from 1961 onwards, you just get this feeling on the one hand, even of people like St. Clair Drake, who were, fellow militants with Nkrumah, who just become, C.L.R. James wrote one of the most profound statements of disenchantment with Nkrumah that you can imagine, right? Like, you can't go arrest a judge or reverse a judicial outcome just because, it sounds funny in America today, right?
Yeah.
But you just can't go about fooling with justice. Justice has to be independent, right? Anyway, there's a tragic cast to all of this, and I don't have an emotionally satisfying answer to it. I think if we could, I talked about ventriloquizing Nkrumah earlier, I think if we could bring somebody like St. Clair Drake to a scene like this to talk about what he could know now and what he knew then, I think he would take a very sympathetic view of the period, even of his deepest disenchantment. C.L.R. James did that. C.L.R. James said of Nkrumah, after having written this condemnation of Nkrumah, C.L.R. James, one of the grand black intellectuals of the 20th century, said, a person of this talent and importance to world history, he didn't say to Africa, comes around once a century. That's C.L.R. James' judgment after he had been through the bitterest disappointments with Nkrumah. So you have to understand the story of Nkrumah as somebody having had to struggle with impossibly insufficient means from the very beginning against colossal powers, external forces, and internal divisions, and often simply having had to try to muddle through.
And the last question of the evening, Smith?
Ms. From the Elder to begin, please. Thank you so much, Bubba. Professor French, thank you for your time and your work. I look forward to reading your book. Quick question. You did mention that Nkrumah was able to achieve Ghanaian liberation and independence nonviolently. Can you speak a little bit to how a black man in the 1950s is able to achieve that in that climate? How Nkrumah was able to achieve the Ghanaian independence nonviolently.
Sure. So there was I'm gonna really do this quickly.
So just remind me of the ministers that closed the sermon three times.
No, we're going to really do this quickly. So Nkrumah gets arrested for incitement of a riot that he didn't cause. Okay? He supported the cause of the people who were protesting, which in an event that turns out to be a riot, but he didn't call the protest, he didn't organize the protest, he didn't incite the riot, and so he and some of the conservative people who he had initially been cooperating with are all carted off to jail, but Nkrumah's treated the most harshly, right? And eventually he ends up spending pretty hard time in isolation in jail, and then in a cell, collective cell with like one vat to do your daily ablutions with and nothing else, no dignity or privacy. And he works out a system. He gives up food and other rations for toilet paper, for squares of, not rolls of toilet, but squares of toilet paper. And he managed to scratch out the basis of a political program and an election strategy on squares of paper that he somehow gets secreted out of this detention center and into the hands, thankfully in historical terms, to the one guy who was proved the most reliable among his lieutenants. And this guy runs the campaign on Nkrumah's behalf and turns the fact of Nkrumah's detention into a motif of the campaign. Like, he's the people's candidate, and look, the British want to lock him up so that he can't win the election. Well, actually, the British didn't actually arrest him for that reason, but that's a great theme, right? And he wins this landslide election, right? He comes out of the jail, and he turns the fact of his arrest into, it turns him into a national hero, in effect. And so this is how he wins the election. He doesn't actually win power altogether yet. He's given a puny title. He's called head of government business by the British. They didn't have the bigness of spirit yet to say, okay, you won the election, you're the prime minister. They invent a title called head of government business for him. But that's how he did it. He won the election from jail through this form of, there's a nice parallel with, I'm going to stop, with Martin Luther King.
Yes. When you mentioned the
Letter.
toilet paper, I thought of Dr. King in jail.
Yes, okay, so we'll just leave it at that.
I do want to get at least one of these questions in from folks watching at home, and I think this one ties back nicely to the beginning. Why is it that some African leaders, Nelson Mandela, for example, have remained in the American psyche, but others, like Nkrumah, remain niche historical figures?
That's a wonderful question. I'm glad we got it in. I assert in the book, based on polls that I've seen here and there, that on the African continent, Kwame Nkrumah is the most revered political figure of the century, of the last century. Okay, so in the West, first of all, I live in New York. I actually live on Broadway. So I often say, if you walk down Broadway, stop people randomly, you ask them a question, what would they be? What would the answer be, right? So if you ask people walking down Broadway to say, name an African, a lot of people wouldn't be able to name an African. But Nelson Mandela might be the person they could name, right? Very few people would name Kwame Nkrumah. Like, Kwame Nkrumah does not occupy a big piece of the public's sort of mind space at this time. So why the discrepancy? Why do Westerners, Americans, and I presume Europeans and certainly British people I got nothing against Nelson Mandela, by the way. I just want to put that out there. But why do they hold Nelson Mandela to such high esteem? I think, I'm going to venture something here. I think it is because South Africa had a white people problem, and they felt, oh, Nelson Mandela was good to the white people. I'm not saying he should have been bad to the white people. I'm saying that to white people, that's a big deal. Kwame Nkrumah won independence for black people. There were no white people involved in that. And so for white people, that's not such a big deal. Like, who the hell? Like, there's, place called Ghana, yeah, it's full of black people. Well, in the West, overcoming apartheid without, a flood of blood in the street is considered like a miracle, partly because of the kind of the notions that people have about Africans. Like, they're savages. They're gonna cut people's heads off, or shoot, rape, lynch, whatever. Actually, that's not what black people did historically. That's what happened to black people historically. But I think that's the essential reason. I'm sorry, I'm looking for people to lock onto here. The questioner was in the virtual audience. I think Nelson Mandela won the status that he has in the Western world and a Nobel Prize for that essential reason that he was so forgiving and generous of spirit after such a long period of horror toward white people. What was the period of horror in Ghana? Actually, it was longer and more horrible, but it didn't involve white people. And so there you have it.
Thank you, Professor French and Mr. Mickey Dean, for this wonderful exchange this evening. Before you leave, in the back, please stop by the table. The library is currently conducting a survey, and we would like to hear from you what type of programming and events or facilities you would like to see the Kansas City Public Library offer. We have a QR code or a paper version, and if you complete your survey tonight, I do have a limited number of free tote bags for you. And lastly, the library, you will see on the table in the back, we have a call for proposals. We are seeking proposals from individuals in Kansas City regarding Kansas City's under-the-radar civil rights history. So if that's the area of your interest, please see the table in the back. And once again, thank you for coming out this evening.
Could I say a quick word?
You have a quick word now?
I do.
Okay.
I want to say thank you to all of you for coming out. I really appreciate the wonderful attention and curiosity you've all demonstrated, and the spirit of the event, and the engagement of my interlocutor here. These have all been fantastic. I spoke during COVID about my last book virtually with this library. It's just wonderful to be able to come here, and I'm working on a book that actually talks about jazz history, and so I did some exploring of Kansas City this afternoon. So this has just been a magnificent day for me, and I want to thank you all.
You mentioned jazz history. This is the week of the Charlie Bird's birthday, so there's a lot of activities going on regarding Charlie Bird this week.
Yep.
I'm Charlie Parker. Charlie Parker. I got Bird on my mind, but Charlie Parker. Thank you once again for coming out.
I think that's the plan, yeah.
Okay.